Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is, I'm Peter Whittle. Now my guest today is one of the new rising stars of commentary on the mainstream media. Inaya Folarin Iman is a columnist for Spiked Online. She's also a director of the Free Speech Union and founder of the Equino Project. And she's with me now. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You have been doing the ghastly mainstream media, as we have to call them, being one of the new media. But basically, you've been talking particularly recently, haven't you, about obviously Black Lives Matter, but also its wider issues, isn't it, about free speech? Those are the things that really seem to concern you.
I guess I've been catapulted into more mainstream consciousness from the kind of Black Lives Matter conversation, but I've been very interested, particularly over the last 2 years, in the issues of freedom of speech, Brexit and democracy, and identity politics, and all of the kind of big picture questions that I think are shaping public discourse at the moment.
Yeah, and so how did you start this? Because you've actually started a foundation yourself, haven't you, called the Equiano Foundation?
Yes, no, it's called the Equino Project. Yes, it's a new organisation launched very recently, and it's to some extent in response to Black Lives Matter, but it's something that I've been thinking about for about a year now. I think that when we talk about issues of race and racism, it's very heated, it's very difficult, and there's increasing inability to have a kind of nuanced and complex conversation about these issues without it being just massive generalizations and with a lot of heat but not a lot of light. And so the Equiano Project is an attempt to respond to that difficulty and kind of bringing people together that are really challenging, honest thinkers on these subjects and having really nuanced and interesting conversations about this, but also championing the more universalist response to race and racism. We hear a lot about identity politics, kind of race consciousness, and essentially arguing that race is the kind of primary organizing principle of society. I reject that conception of society and essentially champion a universalist one.
A universalist one, so based on what? The Enlightenment?
Yes, exactly. I think that this idea that all men are created equal, even the Martin Luther King tradition of the content of your character, not the colour of your skin, and I think that that's what we should be aspiring to actually manifest in society. And I think we were going that way, and actually now we're seeing a kind of re-racialization of society, where race is now the defining way that you should view the world, whether that's through white privilege or black victimhood, and it's homogenizing people based off of race. I think that's a massive step backwards, and I don't think that's how we create a harmonious society.
But do you find that, to me, what you're saying seems entirely logical and commonsensical, but do you find there is, in the media, that your views are considered to be rather eccentric? In the media I'm talking about now.
Yes, no, I think so. I think, we know a lot about the kind of sensationalism in the media, and I think it's very, very convenient to have a kind of narrative that's very simplistic, very black and white, and often reactionary and conflicting. And I think the identity politics one suits that particular narrative very easily. And I think the one that I'm essentially advocating for, I would agree with you, it's actually quite commonsensical. I think it rings true with most people's instinct that no, we shouldn't be judging people by their immediate physical appearance. We should actually be treating everybody as equals and treating them equally. And I think that unfortunately that's kind of been challenged in recent years with the rise of this kind of new type of thinking.
It's come to the fore in a huge way recently, but it's been bubbling along there for a long time. In your own life, when was the first time you really sort of came across what we'd call maybe woke politics or these kind of attitudes, much more sort of, as you say, racializing of everything? When was the first time you really came across?
Yeah, I would say probably in university, but I think I definitely saw seeds with it when I was younger. So one thing about me, I've been to various different types of schools. So for my first secondary school, my first couple of years, I went to a private school, and then I went to a local comprehensive school, which was really ethnically diverse. And when I was at that comprehensive school, I saw a kind of emergence of a kind of racial politics. I mean, there was a kind of the black kids kind of hung out together, and there was a lot about kind of being black and what that meant, and so a lot of those things were kind of emerging during that time, but it wasn't too defining or limiting in the way that I think it really catapulted when I went to university, and seeing the emergence of kind of decolonized curriculum and critical race theory, which essentially argue that race is the most important characteristic, that society is kind of fundamentally and institutionally racist, and there are various things that we must do in order to kind of reorder society against what they kind of conceive of as kind of racist roots. And so that's university was definitely where I saw the most palpable conception of this woke politics that we're seeing now transform our institutions.
Did you see or have you heard about, say, President Trump's speech last night about critical race theory? He made a similar one, didn't he, at Mount Rushmore? But I think yesterday's, it was basically about the ways to stop it. He's just defunded, hasn't he, federal spending on this. I mean, do you think that's a good thing? I mean, did you think it was a good speech?
Yeah, no, I thought it was a brilliant speech. I think, particularly where a lot of this wokeness, so to speak, is coming out of America. I'm a big fan of America, but this is an example of American cultural hegemony dominating, and so there's pros and cons with that. And so they're obviously feeling it in a really strong way. And I understand why he did it. I mean, I think a lot of it is response to the kind of 1619 project, which is trying to essentially rewrite American history to argue that its roots were racist to the core. And I think that's a really dangerous thing. I think that would change how Americans perceive their history and in turn perceive themselves. So I think it's incredibly serious, and I understand why Donald Trump did it. I think it's unfortunate that we're at the point where we are not necessarily able to utilize more democratic mechanisms of making the case against critical race theory, that we essentially have to ban it. But I understand why it is being done, because I think critical race theory, which argues that racism is embedded and endemic in our society, is incredibly divisive. And I think it's a racist ideology.
Well, it is in the end, isn't it? I mean, it goes through old-fashioned liberalism and comes out the other end in a very extreme form. But, I mean, I know you say about banning it. I think that from what I can gather, he's banned funding for these various things like bias training or things like this, unconscious bias. And I think, a lot of people are looking from here and thinking, why can't we do something like that? I mean, why? Because I think the point you make is a very important one, which is that it's a pity we've got to do it that way. So what do you do? Win hearts and minds? Is that what you do? What do you do?
Well, this is the thing. I think, unfortunately in Britain, and I hope this will change, I think we are facing a massive, collapse of political authority. I think we should not necessarily have to take those kind of drastic measures, but we're in a situation where, I mean, in the kind of Black Lives Matter protests, in the height of it, Churchill was boarded up, and we couldn't even have really a political authority that was willing to even defend basic kind of history, the things that actually give us a lot of pride and a sense of national identity and common belonging. And so in an ideal situation, we would hope that, for example, people in positions of authority that create culture or even kind of define politics would actually have the confidence to be able to say, no, that's not the society that we live in. These basic fundamental democratic values or liberal values are not racist. Actually, these are the things that many people are trying to cross the channel to actually get to. I think we should be very grateful for them and cherish them and say that in a very powerful way. But a lot of political elites don't have the confidence, and so sometimes that means drastic measures have to be taken.
When you say a lot of political elites don't have confidence, I mean, there are various particular elites that don't have the confidence, aren't there? I mean, we're talking about the West, if you like, aren't we, on the whole? And I mean, basically, it's not just they don't have the confidence. I'd say there's been a positive collapse in confidence, but also it's this change in the various challenges coming to culture seem to be coming from within the institutions So we've seen like the British Library, the British Museum, very quickly. I mean, were you surprised at the speed with which these things happened during the Black Lives Matter thing? It just seemed to happen like that, didn't it?
Yeah, I think it was an unbelievable speed, and I think it does show the erosion that has happened over a very long period of time, that the kind of fail-safe, so to speak, that we would have that would put brakes on any kind of rapid transformation have been eroded over such a long time. So whether that is the kind of media which we'd hope would be able to, any kind of political movement that emerges, they should be able to hold them to account, ask them difficult questions. That didn't happen. They were all championing them. Or so many of the institutions that we otherwise would have relied on to put the brakes essentially on any kind of rapid change capitulated very, very quickly. And I think part of that has been a lack of faith in the ideals that we talk about, the Enlightenment and liberal values, to bring about a kind of better society, or even the fact that they're not actually articulated in a meaningful way from very early on anymore. And so a movement that makes bold and radical claims about our society in such a kind of powerful way can just change things so quickly. And I think I think it's a stark reminder of where we are at.
I saw you wrote something recently saying that something I think is just undeniable, which is that the right lost the culture war a long time ago. I mean, there's no point in actually sort of talking about it being a battle, that it was lost, but that the only way it can be turned around is if, I think you said, if the conservatives, or conservatives, shall we say, start conserving again.
Yes, I really believe that. I think, if we just take the Tory party, many of the things that we would regard as, even just the example that I just gave earlier about Winston Churchill. I mean, Boris frequently framed himself as the kind of champion of Winston Churchill. This is just a trivial example, but that they haven't been able to stand up, and I think that shows that conservatism for a long time, the kind of ideological or philosophical basis that defines it, has not really been powerful enough for a very long time now. And so I think until they do that, until we start to actually, or conservatives more broadly, start to actually stand up and defend these things and not be afraid to actually do this in the face of being called racist or all of these different things, then I think things will continue, because at least the left, or the woke left in particular, there isn't a line. I don't think there's a point where they'll say, I'm going to stop. I mean, a lot of people, when the kind of statues were originally being toppled, people thought, oh, well, they're just kind of slave owners. We don't mind having them toppled. But it didn't stop. I mean, now we're seeing the University of Edinburgh changing the name of the David Hume Tower. And so that there's no end. And I think I think the conservatives will have to be the ones really that draw a line on this.
But they're just not, are they? They're just not. I mean, why do you think they're so reluctant? I mean, we've talked about this on this show quite a bit before. You've got Trump, right? But then you've also got President Macron, for example, saying, look, this is French history, better or worse, and it's not going to change. Why is it that, everyone's been so lackluster politically? I mean, in the government, do you think?
I think there's a complex range of reasons for that. I think some of them are historical reasons. I think, for example, when we saw in the 20th century, with the kind of with the rise of authoritarianism and kind of Nazism, I think a lot of people associated kind of more strong, forthright, right-wing politics with something that was kind of destructive and negative. And I think, as well as the kind of collapse of the left, with the kind of fall of communism, I think the left lost its kind of belief that there was an alternative as well. And so I think philosophically for both the left and the right, that they are struggling to find what they really mean. And I think even from a kind of conservative perspective, even some of the kind of religious underpinnings that used to underpin conservatism aren't even there either. So I think many of the things, whether that's religiously or philosophically, that would drive conservative politics, they haven't really been able to respond to the changes that things have happened. So I think it's going to be a deep kind of introspection and reflection to be able to find what kind of society going forward do we actually want to create and conserve.
You've actually said as well that we're living in a very therapeutic society. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think we see it with many of the politics at the moment, and I think identity politics is a really good example of that. The way in which people get recognition or get authority in the political sphere is by a grievance-based identity. I think we see it in many ways with kind of trans activism. We see it to a lesser extent with kind of just the feminist movement. But I think the Black activism is one of the most palpable examples of that at the moment. It's not a politics which advocates for agency or kind of responsibility and kind of taking control of one's life and directing oneself into wherever destination we want to go. It's a kind of demand for recognition. It's a demand for kind of external forces to kind of do something for us. And I think that's a very disempowering form of politics. I think it's one which leaves people not feeling able or capable to be able to take control of their life. But I think it manifests itself in a range of different ways.
It's sort of, as you say, it's like putting the victim at the top. It's the primary thing about someone, where you stand on the victimhood pantheon.
Well, exactly. And this is it's not even necessarily an accident. I mean, part of the kind of critical race theory and all of these things is this view of kind of intersectionality, which argues that we all have various kind of identities and they intersect, and where you are on that kind of intersectional hierarchy essentially places you as more authentic. So for example, that's why if you are a straight white male, you're perhaps morally not as superior as someone that is a kind of Black trans woman. And so it's a kind of victimhood hierarchy, and I think that's very much how our politics is shaping at the moment.
So as a woman, a Black woman, where do you stand on it? I mean, I've often tried to work out as a gay man, white man, where do I stand? I think that I must still be sort of like pretty much low in the sense that I'm a white man. But I get this kind of like special pass, I guess, because I'm gay. But the thing is, I'm interesting on that point. The most hostile reactions I've had whenever I've spoken anywhere have been from the gay lobby. Because I'm kind of like I have the wrong views. Now, this must happen to you too, surely?
Yeah, and I think this is...
Not because you're a gay man, but you know what I mean,
Yeah, no, I think this is what happens with identity politics. I think there was a really interesting case, I mean, perhaps in the 60s, when there was very specific forms of discrimination based off of people's identity. There was this concept by this post-colonial theorist called Spivak, called strategic essentialism. So for essentially strategic purposes, you would homogenize in order to kind of advocate for your collective interests. And I thought that was effective during the 60s when there were specific forms of discrimination. But we are not living in that society anymore. And actually that new form of essentialism that has emerged is massively holding people back. So actually, if you are a kind of free-thinking, contrarian or just independent-minded ethnic minority that doesn't really, the things that are being said doesn't really align, you're seen as less authentic. And so it's a new form of stereotyping that people are actually wanting to be stereotyped, and I think it is very problematic.
I mean, do you get abuse? I mean, you're online a lot, aren't you? I mean, do you get abuse for your view? I mean, when you've criticised Black Lives Matter, for example.
Interestingly, I'm still figuring out why, but I don't seem to get as much abuse as other kind of commentators that I've seen on this particular issue criticising Black Lives Matter. I think that I personally don't generally go after people, and I'm very kind of specific with my arguments, and I think I don't try and get too involved in the kind of back and forth kind of conflict, which I think is really unproductive. But I do get criticism, of course, and in some senses I welcome it. I want criticism, but in terms of personal attacks, I think for a lot of people that support Black Lives Matter, they often don't know where to fit me. I've got dreadlocks. I'm not necessarily in the Tory party or anything like that, and I think it seems to confuse them.
Yeah, I think because this week we had a good example of one of those sort of fights in the media with Calvin Robinson, who has been on this channel a couple of times, quite recently in fact, and he really was ripped apart, wasn't he, on Twitter, and they were calling him all sorts of awful names and things, and I thought the pressure in that situation is really intense, actually.
Yeah, I think the situation with Calvin, of course, what he went through was completely unacceptable, but I think it was a really important moment in terms of just exposing just the vitriolic nastiness. And I think it's really telling because particularly those that advocate for Black Lives Matter, they frequently position themselves as coming from a place of moral superiority and doing the right thing. But when the light is often shone on their perhaps contradictions, the nastiness comes out. I think that's very telling. And I think, the more that they do that, I think the more it reveals that I don't think this is a movement based off of kind of principle, based off of trying to genuinely create a better society. It's one that has filled with a lot of vengeful and resentful undertones. And I think someone like Calvin, who is, an ethnic minority man who has his own thoughts and disagrees with it, that's almost the worst thing that can happen to them, because that challenges their whole, conception that they're speaking on behalf of, all people that are black or what have you, and that's just not true.
You mentioned the Tory party there. I mean, do you ever think of, okay, you're building quite a career as a commentator at the moment, but do you ever think of being politically active? I mean, I know you were in the Brexit party, were you?
Yes.
Did you actually stand?
No, I did stand. I stood for the Brexit party for that specific issue of Brexit. That was incredibly important to me, just, respecting such a powerful democratic expression. And I thought the whole situation that happened for 4 years was essentially immoral. And so, so it was important for me to show that, there are a very broad range of Brexiteers. And so in terms of specific party politics, I would say that at this moment it's not necessarily something that I would be involved in. Because I think there are too many issues underlying the political parties at the moment to actually affect the kinds of change that I think needs to happen.
But give us just a few. What are the underlying problems?
Well, I think part of the things that I've been saying, I think if we even lack the basic ability to call out what we saw in those protests, which was, it wasn't even law and order, it was just the basic application of the rule of law, which we would hope in a liberal society would be able to do that. And I think that it shows that the kind of political will needed in order to kind of respond to whether that is the kind of therapeutic and kind of child-centered learning education, not the kind of traditionalist approach which I support, or those kinds of things. I think it seems unlikely. I mean, I don't have complete lack of faith, but I think these are some of the demonstrations that show that I think we're not necessarily at the precipice yet, which would be needed to, I think, hopefully get some life back into the political parties.
So really it comes down, doesn't it, to what we were saying before, that essentially if they're not going to take on in any serious way these cultural issues, then you're not interested, really. Is that right? You would personally not be interested in? Well,
I think I do think I mean there's a quote I think from Andrew Breitbart. I think he said politics is downstream from culture.
That's right. Yeah. We live by that here.
Oh, really? I think there's a lot of truth in that. Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth in that, and I think that if the culture within our society is, I guess, what cultivates a sense of agency, responsibility, a sense of kind of a vibrant democratic spirit. And if you're not willing to be part of the process that ignites that, then I think you're going to have a very lackluster politics.
Yeah. I think which is what we've got, actually. At this point on Brexit, it's not unlike Claire Fox. She that was the one specific thing, but they saw it very, very clearly in terms of this wasn't a real attempt. Presumably, this is how you saw it. A real attempt to overthrow, for better or worse, a decision that was made. And but that really brings me just to one other thing I think is quite interesting. I think you've touched on this before, and that is that absent from all of the discussions and the protests and everything, is any kind of real talk about class or inequality. Almost nothing. This is not one of their preoccupations. This is the would you call them identitarians? This is not really one of their concerns, is it?
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the most disturbing, in some senses, aspects of this kind of cultural malaise that we're experiencing. I think it very much suits a kind of politics that isn't really interested in getting to the deep-rooted issues of kind of extreme inequality or the different issues that are affecting society. So it stays on these superficial things like people's gender or their race. And I think and I would fundamentally disagree with the idea that your race in Britain can hold you back in life. I think Britain perhaps should actually almost congratulate itself on its achievement in terms of going from a society that was, colonial and all of the things that happened in the past, to be able to forge a society that people from all different backgrounds can achieve great heights. And so, I think that the kind of identity politics is a massive deflection from actually perhaps a class politics. I wouldn't necessarily think class is I wouldn't take a class reductionist perspective, but I would definitely argue that class is perhaps a more significant determiner of your ability to access different spaces than your race, most definitely.
Oh yeah, but my fear is that it's growing. If you look at social mobility, if you look in education, people who get on now have usually been privately educated, or far more than maybe when I was growing up.
Yes.
Far more when I was sort of teenager in the 70s, and it's far more social mobility. I think half and half at Oxbridge, public, private.
No, I completely agree on that. And this is another thing that's really interesting with the race issue. And this is a statistic that many people don't know about. So for 16 to 30-year-olds, black people that live in Britain, they're actually at income parity with their white counterparts. Now that's very significant upward levels of social mobility from ethnic minority people of the previous generation. So their children are actually doing really, really well. So when it comes to actual social mobility, ethnic minority Britons are actually doing much better than their white British counterparts. So what's really interesting again is that, a lot of the time, even these kinds of, quotas or diversity schemes end up benefiting middle class ethnic minority. And then the people that are facing various structural barriers, regardless of race, are completely ignored. And a very similar thing happens in America as well.
Yes. There's a fundamental difference, though, in racial history, isn't there, between Britain and America? And I mean, again, one of the interesting things is the ease with which it's been adopted here as somehow being, the same history, and it's really not.
Yes, I think it's very concerning that in some senses, particularly many of these Black Lives Matter activists have wanted to have a similar history to America, which is one that is full of trials and tribulations and also triumphs, but not one that can be reasonably compared to Britain. I think anyone that tries to import the American racial culture wars to Britain cannot be taken seriously. There are many fundamental differences. I mean, the overwhelming majority of African Americans obviously came as a result of transatlantic slavery, and they had the history of kind of Jim Crow and the civil rights movement. So they have a relatively unified history that's very different to the Black British story, which is one of heterogeneity, whether that's the kind of Windrush generation to more recent people from kind of West Africa, and to even kind of Black British people from hundreds of years ago. So it's very disparate in terms of the story. It's not one that is unified. But also, for example, in America, there was laws against interracial relationships. In Britain, actually, a Black Caribbean man is more likely to have a kid with a white woman than a Black woman. So we're talking about one that's a much more kind of integrated history. Actually, working class people, particularly in the 70s and 80s, were at the forefront of anti-racist activism, and Black and white people stood together in a much more unified way. In Britain, in America, kind of poor whites and poor Blacks don't necessarily have a unified politics. So there's so many differences, and I think the whole controversy over Adele's kind of outfit, as kind of trivial as it was, it really highlighted that, you know, we have things like the Notting Hill Carnival, which brings together people of all ethnicities, and American people didn't understand that. You know, they thought it was cultural appropriation, when actually it was completely normal here in Britain. So I think that we import the American narrative at our peril.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't that something that we vaguely imported as well, the whole cultural appropriation argument? It's sort of, not quite, it's lapping around the edges, isn't it?
Yes, it's not taking off as powerfully in Britain, but it's definitely something that we have been hearing more and more of, and it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning in terms of what the Equiano Project tries to promote, which is a universalism, and one that focuses on the future and what kind of society we're trying to create. Because are we really saying that we should all stay in our fixed, you know, essential racial or cultural silos? How can we create a kind of an integrated society, a kind of with bonds of solidarity and community, if everything is defined so rigidly? And we have our own version of that in Britain with kind of multiculturalism as a public policy, which basically categorizes people based off of cultures and seeks to kind of manage them in that way. So we have our own kind of version, but I think it's not working.
The thing is with multiculturalism here is that, you know, as an idea, it was being challenged, 10, 15 years ago. I mean, Angela Merkel made a speech about it. We have to accept it's not worked. David Cameron did. But it's still very much the default position. And and certainly, for example, in local councils, it seems like it hasn't trickled down. The idea that somehow we should say we are a multi-ethnic society with an overarching, you know, unifying set of values. But it's very much now still, I think, in the lifeblood, in the cultural lifeblood, that we're multicultural. It's a fundamental difference. I think America is actually, they've taken a leaf out of our book there, haven't they? Because it was always a melting pot in America, but not anymore.
No, exactly. I mean, there was a thing, I think it was in the New York Times, where they were going to start capitalizing B for black and W for white, and saying that they're specific, distinct, separate cultures. And I think that's a horrifying step. I think that's a backward step. What we should be doing is, even, you know, I get the multi-ethnic, but sometimes I just think we shouldn't even have to think about things in that way. We are British citizens, and we are all, you know, stand on an equal footing and should be conceiving of ourselves as one nation. And we don't have that. Again, back to what we were talking earlier about, the confidence to just reject all of this type of politics and say that it's just not working. And I think multiculturalism does a lot of damage to natural social cohesion, but also to the cultures that people are seeking to protect. Because if you are for example, this is obviously a generalization, but if you are perhaps a gay Muslim, you know, man, you won't be seen as authentic as perhaps a kind of so-called traditional Muslim leader, and that keeps people actually in a very static position. That's not a progressive society, in my opinion.
You're in your 20s, aren't you?
Yes.
Okay. We're hearing a lot, and I think with a lot of justification, of the extraordinary level of indoctrination in education. We've certainly talked about it on these programs. Some people, though, seem to slip through the net, and I wonder how you sort of slipped through the net. How does it work? I mean, if you're going from school to university, and just look, honestly, when I've spoken, like at universities and things, they're entirely the same views about virtually everything. So, I mean, how have you managed, as it were, to come out the other end with your own thoughts and your own judgment intact?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I would agree with you. That was something quite astonishing. When I speak at universities as well.
Have you always had views? I mean, I'm sorry, but have you been political? How long have you been political, really?
I think I became perhaps politically conscious at about 14 years old. I think I'm very lucky. So my mum, you know, she is very conservative-minded, and from very young, she kind of engaged my sister and I in political thinking and ideas, and kind of encouraged us to kind of question everything. And so, going into environments of kind of ideological conformity, I think I already had a kind of suspicion of anything that was too powerfully trying to say what to think versus how. And so I think instinctively, by the time I'd already got to university, I'd cultivated a kind of sense of suspicion towards those things, and yeah, so I distance myself from that kind of that kind of ideological conformity quite early on. But I think it is hard, you know. At university, I think it is the tide is very one way. I remember being very surprised that despite the fact that the country overwhelmingly voted, you know, one way in regards to the Brexit referendum, I wasn't exposed to any pro-Brexit opinion, and so how can we cultivate, you know, independent-minded, you know, responsible citizens when the brain of our society is just so conformist? I think there's a lot to do when it comes to the education and university sector.
Well, it's sort of closing in on itself, isn't it? I mean, some people like Roger Scruton have said the only thing we can possibly do is actually, certainly with the humanities, just they're gone. Forget about them. Start new things up. You know, I think there's a chance. You know.
Yeah.
And I think more and more people are thinking. Well, look, it's been lovely to talk to you. And what's on the cards for you now? What are you going to be doing next?
So I think the Equiano Project for me is really where my focus is in, at least for the medium term. I think with the unconscious bias, diversity training, all of these things coming down the pipe to many organisations, I think that I'm trying to create an alternative, one that kind of champions the things that we've been discussing about, you know, our common humanity, emphasising what unites us, not what divides us. And I think that people need to be aware that there is an alternative to this thinking, one that is actually promoting harmony, not constant division.
Well, how can people become involved? Is it something where they can become involved?
Yes.
Can they become members?
Yes, you can go onto the equianoproject.com, and I think there's information in terms of how to get involved, in terms of even events. So we're starting kind of community events where people can be part of participating and shaping this conversation, not just our expert-led events. So there's many different things that people can actually get involved in to be part of this conversation and changing this extreme division that we're seeing in regards to race.
Well, look, thank you very, very much. What we'll do, we'll put on the programme when it goes out a link to the project. And also, obviously, I mentioned the Free Speech Union with Toby Young. You're doing quite a bit of work with them, aren't you?
Yes.
You're on the board.
Yes,
right?
I'm on the board. Okay. And I think it's a brilliant organisation. I think, as I said earlier, in terms of, you know, as we get more to the precipice, it in some sense necessitates a response. And now we're seeing much more organisations starting saying, no, you know, we're not going to just allow this to drive through such an amazing, you know, country and society that we live in, and the Free Speech Union.
Can I ask you one final question?
Sure.
Because it's one. Is that you say when we go towards the precipice? I don't mean you to be too literal-minded if you don't, but what would that look like, do you think?
Well, I think that, you know, when the Black Lives Matter protests came about, I mean, first and foremost, I hope that in nowhere, anywhere now, I don't think we're going to get to the point of America, which is these riots and things going on, really horrific violence and dangerous stuff. I think that that's completely too far. But I think at least with the Black Lives Matter protests, I think we saw a kind of window in terms of where things could go, where everything is defined by race in every single element and layer of our society, that kids are being taught, you know, about white privilege and these types of things. I think that is a road that we don't want to go down, that we shouldn't go down. And I hope that when people will observe the things that have happened over the last few months and realise that each of us individually as well as collectively now needs to kind of say no, whether that's in our workplaces or in our schools, in our organisations. We don't have to essentially capitulate to this thinking.
It would take a bit of guts then, won't it, for people?
No, I think it does take guts, but I think nothing worthwhile is easy, especially something as precious as the society that we have today. And I think hopefully that will inspire people to perhaps become much more active participants in shaping and defending what we value.
Perfect. On that note, thank you very, very much. Thanks. Thank you for that. Next week we'll be back. In the meantime, I'd like, as I always do at these programmes, to remind you of our campaign Save Our Statues.org.uk. Please do subscribe to that, as well as subscribing to this. It's obviously going great guns. So thank you very much, and see you next week.